the stage is set for Dr. Gerald Horne, the people's historian. Dr. Horne is chair of history and African American studies at the University of Houston, author of more than 40 books, all of the historiography of radical tradition, to unearth it and to grow it. And it is always a particular honor to have Dr. Horne with us. Thank you so much for your always educating, agitating, and organizing to empower us, the people's historian, Dr. Gerald Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, under the pretext of anti-Semitism, how the suppression of the Palestinian people is accompanied by suppression of the attempt to defend their cause. Help us understand this, because the topic really is today looking at the persecution, suppression, and repression, albeit under the pretext of anti-Semitism. But is this a new McCarthyism that we have to understand and prepare for? And indeed, what does McCarthyism really mean in its historic context?
Well, the term McCarthyism could more conveniently be used to describe what has afflicted the exercise of free speech rights in this country going back to the bad old days of slavery. Recall that during the bad old days of slavery, abolitionist literature was fundamentally outlawed and illegalized in the South, not least attacks on abolitionist speakers. You may recall that it was in Western Illinois, not in the South, that Elijah Lovejoy, an abolitionist publisher, was actually assassinated. We also know that after the abolition of slavery, you had those who were advocating for voting rights for the newly emancipated. They were lynched. They were tarred and feathered. We know that during World War I, those who were advocating for an anti-war position were often jailed. We know that during the Red Scare, not that long ago, let's say in the last 70 years, you had loyalty oaths for faculty. That is to say, you had to swear allegiance to an anti-communist hegemony or face the risk of being purged or lose your jobs. This was not just in universities. Recall that it was W.E.B. Du Bois, a founder of the NAACP, who was ousted from the organization he founded in 1948 because he had the gumption, audacity, and temerity to back a third-party challenge, the Progressive Party, which, of course, went down to defeat. We also know that filmmakers in Hollywood, such as Dalton Trumbo, perhaps the most talented screenwriter Hollywood has produced to this point, and his comrade John Howard Lawson, were both jailed because of spirited confrontations with the House Un-American Activities Committee. You had labor leaders like Ferdinand Smith, born in Jamaica, a founder of the National Maritime Union, who refused to toe the anti-communist line and as a result was deported from the United States unceremoniously circa 1950. You had George Crockett, known to your audience, I'm sure, as a leading member of the Congressional Black Caucus in the 1980s. But before then, in 1949, he was a lawyer for the Communist Party defendants in Foley Square. And because of his spirited advocacy, not only were his clients jailed, he was jailed, a lawyer jailed because of spirited advocacy. We know that in 1969, you had the professor, Angela Davis, who came under fire at UCLA because of her refusal to repudiate her membership in the Communist Party. And it wasn't just the Communist Party. Richard Flax, a faculty member at the University of California, Santa Barbara, came under fire because of his association with Students for a Democratic Society. So if you fast forward to today and you see what happened to a professor at Dartmouth in New Hampshire, a Jewish studies professor who was attempting to exercise solidarity with those involved in the pro-Palestinian encampment, was roughhoused. You saw the same thing happen to the chair of the philosophy department at Emory University in Atlanta. You saw that the University of Texas at Austin, you had a scene from perhaps Odessa in 1905 when police officers on horses waded into a crowd, roughhousing and manhandling student encampment protesters. We see that if you go to your website, and I would not recommend this, but if you go to the website of Canary Mission, it's a pro-Zionist so-called blacklisting operation, and I'm afraid to say that you'll find my name there amongst others in an attempt to rout even those who are tenured faculty, such as myself, and of course non-tenured faculty have even a rougher time of it. As a result, you see that on the West Coast at the University of California at Santa Cruz, you see that faculty are in solidarity with staff that are protesting and graduate students that are protesting because of the inability to exercise free speech rights on behalf of Palestinian rights. You see that this is nothing new. I'm sure, Mimi, you recall what happened in the 1980s at Stony Brook University on Long Island when the South African-born activist and academic Fred Dubé came under fire because of his adamant refusal to repudiate anti-Zionism. And in fact, you can draw a straight line from Fred Dubé, a stalwart member of the African National Congress of the 1980s, to what the ANC government is doing in South Africa today, that is to say, dragging Israel before the dock in the International Court of Justice and making a plausible case for genocide. So this question of suppression of free speech rights, this question of a so-called new McCarthyism, you could also say that it's just an expression of an old McCarthyism that is being revived in 2024.
I just want to mention, along with this list and your thoughts on it, I couldn't help but think about Lynn Stewart, who essentially had her life really truncated because she was ill. And when you are prosecuted and sent to prison, your, medical genocide really takes place amongst anybody who is incarcerated. So there was a great lawyer, Lynn Stewart, for the work she did and to chill her speech, who was prosecuted and sent to prison. There's the African People's Socialist Party today on espionage charges, in effect, for doing what they've always done, which is talking about self-determination for the people of African ancestry in this country. There's Julian Assange and so on. Do you see this as part of what we're talking about, which is a democratic facade that uses legal and legislative means to suppress dissent by any and all means?
Facade, indeed. Recall that in my previous remarks, I was talking about what was happening in the 19th century, for example, when we have been instructed that there was a First Amendment to the United States Constitution that protected freedom of speech. I think it's fair to say that, as you know, as a lawyer, there's a question as to whether or not the First Amendment even applied in the states. And certainly it was a question as to whether it applied even in Washington, D.C., where it was supposed to apply. But in the shadow of the Capitol, you had enslaved Africans being sold like so much livestock. And if you come forward to what's happening today, you saw the spectacle of President Shafiq of Columbia University casually tossing faculty overboard during that congressional hearing a few weeks ago in Washington, D.C. At UCLA on April 30th, you saw that the law enforcement officers, including campus police, stood aside as pro-Zionist thugs, some of whom, I'm afraid to say, were funded and subsidized by the spouse of comic Jerry Seinfeld, who happens to be of Syrian Jewish descent, by the way. They waded into the crowd with projectiles of various sorts, sending many pro-Palestinian protesters into hospitals. I should also mention the fact that this attack on free speech rights does not just encompass those who are seeking to engage in solidarity with Palestine. In the current issue of the American Historical Review, the leading journal in the historian's field, there's an article by historian Woody Holton that deals with attacks on Black history. For example, in the state of Florida, the attack on the 1619 Project, which has been ruled out of bounds legally in a number of states. At Indiana University in Bloomington, you see that there is now a ruling that faculty have to present balanced presentations in class. I assume that that means if you present an anti-Nazi point of view, you have to present a pro-Nazi point of view. You see the attack on tenure at many campuses from the Atlantic to the Pacific. At the University of Florida in Gainesville, where the president is a former Republican senator from Nebraska, speaking of Ben Sasse, you have the construction of a new so-called free enterprise college, Hamilton College. And it'll be interesting to see if the faculty hired in that particular institution will be held to the same standards in terms of publishing, for example. But amidst the gloom and doom, I should mention a few positive points with regard to the state of Florida, for example, which is ground zero in terms of repression. You see that the young Black tennis star, Coco Gauff, has been speaking out vigorously against what's going on in her home state. In yesterday's USA Today, you had Emmitt Smith, a three-time Super Bowl football winner, an alumnus of the University of Florida, speaking out vigorously against the attacks on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as well, you see that there is a fight back and a pushback, not least on the West Coast. But in that regard, I should mention a story in the Washington Post that has not gotten that much publicity. I assume you've covered it on WBAI, which talks about in the run-up to the crackdown at Columbia University, you had this WhatsApp group comprised of billionaires, such as Barry Sternlicht, an alumnus of Brown University, who's been putting pressure on that particular institution. They, in turn, were putting pressure on Mayor Eric Adams of New York to send in the cops to Columbia. I doubt if Mayor Adams needed that much pressure to begin with, since he is beholden to those particular interests. But I would like to warn these pro-Zionist billionaires that they may find themselves in a quandary sooner rather than later, because there is a growing sentiment in the ruling elite of the United States that this being bogged down in historic Palestine is forcing the United States to turn its attention away from what it considers to be the so-called real threat. I'm speaking of the People's Republic of China, and not to mention the summit that took place just a few days ago between President Putin and President Xi in China. And so this is a very complex political moment. And I would just like to end by mentioning a point to our friends on the left, which is that I noticed quite understandably and justifiably you invoke the term settler colonialism to apply to historic Palestine. But alas, unfortunately, the term settler colonialism is rarely applied to what has befallen North America in the past few centuries. Obviously, this so-called republic started off as a settler colonial apartheid state. And likewise, I noticed that many of our friends on the left oftentimes use this term identity politics as a descriptor to defame various wings of the Black liberation movement. But in Israel, you have a state based on an exclusivist ethno-religious identity politics writ large. But I dare and defy anyone in your audience to ever find a person on the left who's defined Israel as an identity politics state writ large. So we have a lot of work to do, but I'm confident that we'll be able to attain our goals.
Well, one of the things that I'm interested in your thoughts on, the anti-union lobby's newest weapon. They are now armed with cynical anti-Semitism allegations. The corporate-backed effort to destroy unions is ramping up, and this is part of it. I just want to point out that my own union, Local 2223, the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys, which is a part of the UAW, has been sued and also summoned to the horrific committee that Republican Representative Virginia Foxx is heading the House Education and Workforce Committee, all with these allegations of creating hostile work environments. By the way, that was the committee that Shafiq, the president of Colombia, who just received a vote of no confidence, appeared before and threw education, among other things, under the bus. But that committee now has taken up the issues. So what I'm interested in is, while I'm putting everything under the rubric of kind of McCarthyism, but the fact of the matter is that there is a huge attack, which I think is deliberately using the conceptualization and the legitimate concern about real anti-Semitism as a mechanism to suppress and harass. So, as I was beginning to say, our union has now been subpoenaed. Our union for having taken a democratic vote and authored a resolution in support of a ceasefire. That is the immediate pretext for calling us before this committee, which no doubt is to suppress the voice of labor. So I'm interested in your thoughts about using the stalking horse, if you will, of alleged anti-Semitism as a further way of legislating against education, against the voice, or putting the movement back in the labor movement that has been occurring most mightily through the Amazon Workers Union, through the UAW, and so on. So I want people to be clear-eyed and understand this period of repression that we're in, which I think is manipulating and using the issue of anti-Semitism to get a hook.
Well, indeed, and the hypocrisy stinks to high heaven. You recall that it was not so long ago that Black students complaining about racism on campus were told to stiffen their spines, otherwise be derided as snowflakes. And yet, at the same time, we were told that being on campus it's mandatory that students are confronted with uncomfortable ideas. Except now, when it comes to pro-Zionist students, the script has flipped, and now you have congressional hearings. You have another one that will be unfolding today, a replay of what took place with President Shafiq at Columbia. This time in the dock will be presidents of UCLA, Rutgers, and Northwestern University, who will be harassed as the Republicans preen and posture as defenders of Jewish students, defenders of pro-Zionist students. But at the same time, I cannot help but think of a recent opinion by Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, who warned that the right wing is weaponizing the First Amendment. And you see that on display this afternoon, I'm afraid to say, at this congressional hearing. But likewise, we should also mention a more positive note. That is to say, with regard to my aforementioned comments about the West Coast and the University of California at Santa Cruz, leading the job actions there in protests against the suppression of First Amendment rights of faculty, staff, and students is precisely the United Auto Workers Local. They've done the same thing at UCLA, and I dare say that by attacking the UAW, which under the leadership of Sean Fain has had a kind of revival in terms of organizing, in terms of militancy, the right wing is basically poking a stick into a hornet's nest and inevitably will be stung to their detriment.
We're speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne, the people's historian. And one of the things, since you unearth, in order for us to indeed educate and organize from the history that is so often suppressed. And I want you to talk about, this is certainly not the first time right-wing forces have justified attacks on unions, for example, by pointing to worker opposition to U.S. foreign policy. And I want you to just recount for us, which I'm sure is at the tip of your imagination and tongue and knowledge, perhaps going back even to the late 40s, the 1940s, when the so-called communist trade unions stood up against the emerging Cold War, because I want people to understand that this is a habitual and perpetual tool, this suppression against dissent, and it's something that has to be incorporated into our organization to thwart these legislative efforts which are seeking to permanently harness and destroy any opportunity for, in particularly now, the education and I think the labor sphere, dissent against the policies of the state and federal government.
Well, recall that during the bad old days of the Red Scare, the unions that came under the fiercest attack were precisely those unions who were interested not only in uplifting the wages and working conditions of their members, but also were valiantly predisposed to confront Jim Crow and white supremacy. First and preeminent on that list was West Coast Longshore under the Australian-born leader, Harry Bridges, which in the 1930s executed that rarest of events, a general strike in San Francisco, the city by the bay, and that led to the ILWU, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, being able to organize from Seattle to San Diego. But it did not take long for the U.S. authorities to come after Harry Bridges, to come after the union leadership on spurious grounds of anti-communism. And Harry Bridges was able to fight off that particular offensive, but not without cost to the union. I'm afraid to say as well that those who should have stood by him, particularly the NAACP, did not stand by him. Instead, they opted to support anti-communist unions, which oftentimes were anti-Black unions, such as the Seafarers International Union, and such as the East Coast Longshore, speaking of the International Longshore Association. So this is an apt lesson to contemplate today in 2024 as we face and encounter and endure another wave of political repression, fundamentally grounded on a spurious basis, this time with Palestinian rights being in the crosshairs. But happily, the global tides are surging in our favor. I'm speaking of the International Criminal Court and pending indictment of the war cabinet in Israel led by Prime Minister Netanyahu. I'm speaking of the recognition of an emerging Palestinian state by Spain, Ireland, and Norway. I'm speaking of the aforementioned case before the International Court of Justice in The Hague brought by South Africa, joined by Egypt and Turkey and Colombia, which already has made out a plausible case for genocide. I'm speaking of the fact that at Morehouse College this past Sunday, President Biden was compelled to issue rhetoric, perhaps empty rhetoric in the long term, with regard to calling for a ceasefire, although he did not call for a cessation of weapons of war from the United States to Israel. That was left to Congresswoman Stefanik, a Trumpista in bad standing, who spoke before the Israeli Knesset to that regard and denounced the foreign policy of the United States of America and called, in essence, for further genocide to be inflicted against the indigenous inhabitants of historic Palestine. So this is a very deep struggle we're now enmeshed in. However, I'm confident that at the end of the day will emerge victorious per usual.
I want to push a little further. You know, the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, which, as I noted earlier, is chaired by Representative Virginia Foxx, seems to be following in UAC's footsteps. The House Un-American Activity Committee, using the hysteria that greets any criticism of Israel to resurrect the spirit of McCarthyism. So anti-abortion, this woman is anti-LGBTQ, anti-immigrant, this Republican who once said that unions shouldn't legally exist. Fox now represents herself as a crusader against anti-Semitism in order to attack two of the right's traditional foes, again, academia and organized labor. So Fox committees making headlines. Well, how do you analyze or look at this period that we are in writ large, really, and using this rising moral panic around anti-Semitism as giving new ammunition, not only to demagogic politicians, but also to the well-organized corporate-funded lobby that has long worked behind the scenes to undo all the gains of the New Deal and to annihilate the labor movement? Where are we at now?
Well, we're at a very perilous moment. I would warn the pro-Zionist forces to be very careful with regard to associating with these Republican rightists. Recall the vote on the so-called Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which seeks to give a very narrow and suffocating definition of anti-Semitism through which to bash the progressive movement. Recall that a number of Republicans, led by Matt Gaetz of Florida and Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia, voted against that act, not on progressive grounds, but because they thought that it would call into question the right-wing Christian idea that somehow Jewish people have been responsible or were responsible for the slaying of the person they consider to be their Lord and Savior, speaking of Jesus Christ. We know that that particular canard has been used historically for centuries to undergird anti-Jewish pogroms, to undergird the Inquisition launched on the Iberian Peninsula about 500 or 600 years ago, which led to an acceleration of the Jewish diaspora, leading many Jewish people to flee Spain and Portugal, oftentimes for the Americas, oftentimes for Turkey. And so by empowering these anti-Jewish forces, these anti-Semitic forces, the real anti-Semitic forces, the pro-Zionist community, I'm afraid to say, might be jeopardizing their own existence. And so we're going to have to save them from themselves, because obviously they're not thinking clearly. Obviously they've been seduced and bedazzled by this nationalist project of Zionism in Israel, which is now, according to the historian Ilan Pappé, coming to a crashing, screeching halt. He says that we're in the foothills of the beginning of the end of the entire Zionist project. And this is what Mr. Netanyahu has perpetrated. This is where he has led his flock. And again, we're going to have to save them from themselves.
Any thoughts about also organizations like the Liberty Justice Center, which helped win one of the more horrible decisions in labor before the Supreme Court, the Janus decision, and now really arms and again is weaponizing anti-Semitism, but the legal arena is being used as a constant now to try to bankrupt organizations. There are also threats even to, I shouldn't say even to, but to media organizations such as ours about whether we can maintain our tax-exempt status if we speak out too aggressively against the crimes of empire and the like. So just to take it a step further, would you define this period as a kind of a creeping fascism, a neo-fascism, or just to, again, understand and contextualize the struggle that must and will go on around Palestine and other various issues?
Well, creeping neo-fascism indeed. And I would argue further that the settler colonial projects, which oftentimes, particularly in the case of North America, and not least in the case of historic Palestine, are based upon class collaboration. That is to say, an alliance between and amongst settlers of various class stripes and class hues. You have seen this particularly in North America. And class collaboration inevitably carries the seeds of fascism. I don't think you can begin to understand the Trump base and the Trump coalition. You cannot begin to understand the fact that 75 million people voted for Mr. Trump in 2020. It would be mathematically imprecise to say that 75 million were all part of the 1% in a country of 330 million. Obviously, he had substantial support amongst the Euro-American working class, the Euro-American middle class. You saw that exemplified on January 6, 2021, with the attempted interruption of a peaceful transfer of power. And I'm afraid to say that this class collaborationist ethos has legal support. Look no further than the U.S. Supreme Court and the scandals enveloping Justice Samuel Alito, who flew the symbol of the Stop the Steal movement, this inauthentic, corrupt idea that Mr. Trump actually won in 2020, and it was up to true patriots, so-called, to stop the steal. He flew his flag upside down at his Virginia estate, at his vacation house. It now turns out, according to today's New York Times, he had another symbolic flag, this one expressing Christian nationalism, I'm afraid to say, that was flying at that particular abode. And that's not even talk about Clarence Thomas and his being subsidized by billionaires of various types, particularly the most odious of them all, those with roots in the Lone Star State that is Texas. And so this is a formidable coalition that we're facing. That is to say, an idea that the clock will be turned back to the bad old days when, of course, Jim Crow ruled the land, when women did not have reproductive freedom. This is what we're facing. But once again, I'm confident that we'll be able to beat right back this neo-fascist attack.
And I just want to mention, since I rather cavalierly mentioned the Janus case and the Liberty Justice Center, I was really speaking about the lawsuit against the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys, which aims to, which is filed by the Liberty Justice Center, one of the right-wing law firms behind the Janus case. And the suit is an attempt to use the union's pro-Palestinian position as a justification to extend Janus to private organizations that receive government funding. And the suit argues that since the plaintiff's employer is contracted by the New York City to provide legal counsel to indigent defendants, Janus should apply to its staff. This is not the first effort by anti-union groups to really broaden the scope of Janus. And we'll do a whole program on that, but it's very important. But the issue is to understand that there is an organized right-wing assault and various institutions like the Liberty Justice Center, like the committee chaired by Virginia Fox, to use, again, the stalking horse and the absolute red herring of the legitimacy of the Palestinian efforts for liberation to connote that they are inherently, when you are anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic. And of course, we uncouple anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So we have miles to go before we sleep. And the point of all of this is to support our siblings, the Palestinian people, for the Palestinian nation, and for self-determination. And your final thoughts on perhaps your own university and the ongoing struggle to continue to build. And there is a national conference this weekend, which we'll find out more about. But there's an ongoing effort, and there must be a worldwide effort to support and to liberate Palestine. Your thoughts, Gerald Horne?
Well, you speak of Texas, and I'm afraid to say that when you look at Texas and when you realize historically that in the 19th century, the indigenous population ruled a good deal of what was then called the Lone Star State, particularly the Comanches, the Lords of the Plains, but they were subjected to mass genocide. And again, as I say in my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, this was a class collaborationist project. That is to say, there were two options on the table in Texas. One was to put the indigenous on reservations. The other was to liquidate them altogether. Of course, in Texas, as usual, they opted for the more heinous, more disgraceful option, which is liquidation. And to come to today, once again, we need deeper thinking on this question of settler colonialism. We should not find it to be accidental that when you have a visit from an African head of state unfolding this week, a state visit, that it comes from Kenya, a former settler colonial regime in East Africa, which of course was booted partially out of power by the so-called Mau Mau revolt of the 1950s. We should not find it coincidental that the first Black president in the United States history, Barack Obama, of course, had roots in Kenya, that settler colonial regime. And so we have a steep uphill climb ahead of us. It'll require, I'm afraid to say, new thinking and reinvigorated thinking, but most of all, reinvigorated activism.
Well, with your guidance, historically and contemporaneously, to use that history to take us on the path forward, we will indeed overcome. I want to thank you as always, and let our listeners know, we're going to have Gerald back very soon to talk about a new book of his. Not even going to tell you what it is now. I just want you to stay tuned and stay posted. And maybe we can even bring Gerald into New York to talk about one of his new books. One of the most important contributors to us doing what? Educating, agitating, and organizing to empower the people. The people's historian, Dr. General, I was going to say, well, you are my general, as much as I'm interested in militarism, but I'm certainly interested in winning and leadership. And Dr. Horne is always there to provide that for us. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for speaking with us. And we'll have you back soon.
Thank you for inviting me.